welcome to our short video series. Venom S is a fantastic sports car that uses the S-type Jaguar as a donor vehicle. This is a first in the kit car industry in the UK, so I thought it would be useful to do a video showing how to harvest the donor parts to be used. All the work you see was carried out by me single-handed. The only special equipment I used was the crane and body dollies. You can hire a workshop crane which will do the same job, and the dollies, although useful, are not essential. The total time taken was around 20 hours. I hope you enjoyed watching the videos, and if you do have any questions, please drop me an email.
In preparation for removing the engine, etc., we need to drain the radiator and power steering reservoir, and also remove the bonnet and the cover panel at the base of the windscreen. There is no need to drain the engine oil.
Okay, so we've removed the plastic cover that goes onto the slam panel. It's just on the floor. That's held in various plastic clips and fixings, most of which you'll probably be missing. So our next task is to remove the airbox and the top radiator mounts, which you can see here. Those are the top radiator mounts held in with 3 bolts. There's one on each side. And the airbox is located. The airbox is located here. So we're going to remove that and trunking that goes into the throttle body and the associated wiring in preparation. That's going to give us room to get access to the pipes which run down that side of the engine into the radiator.
We've removed the radiator top mount and airbox, which is held in with a single 8mm bolt. Directly underneath the airbox sits the pipework to the power steering cooler and reservoir. These are on the low pressure side, so simply undo the hose clamps and plug the ends to reduce fluid loss. The bottom radiator hose also sits in this area and can be detached from the radiator. Use a drip tray to contain the fluid loss.
This is the service filling point on the Jaguar engine for the coolant system. So undo that plug.
The next step is to remove the fan and shroud, which is held in place with 2 8mm bolts at the top and slots into clips at the bottom. We can then remove the radiator and the power steering radiator and the air conditioning radiator. Our first step is to disconnect the engine wiring harness from the ECU. The engine harness is self-contained, so we don't need to disconnect individual components on the engine. The connector blocks sit underneath a bulkhead shroud in front of the pollen filter on the near side corner of the engine bay. The filter is held with 2 clips that simply slides out. There are a series of 11mm nuts which hold in the filter casing and shroud. After removing these, the casing and shroud will simply lift away.
Okay, so now we've managed to pull the shroud out. If I move the camera underneath, you can see where all the electrical connectors are that go into the engine ECU, which is located under the dashboard. And this is pretty much, a self-contained wiring loom for this engine. So just come out again a little bit. we can see how all these connectors kind of like go up into the engine wiring loom. This is the main part of the loom here that goes up over, drives things like the injectors and the coils, and then goes around to the alternator and generator, wires for the oxygen sensors and power steering pump and air conditioning pump. All feeds over into that direction. So okay, so what we've done now is we've removed all the electrical connectors and just stowed them away on top of the engine. Right, okay, so what we've done now is we've raised the vehicle up on stands at the front, and we've removed the road wheels, and this is going to give us access to subframe mounting bolts and the gearbox subframe mounting bolts underneath, which we're going to need to remove. What we'll do is move the crane in to take the weight of the engine and subframe, and then we'll just drop that out of the car, refit the road wheels, drop that out, and then we'll pick the front end of the car up and just roll the entire subframe, gearbox, etc. out from underneath. Okay, just come round to the off side of the vehicle, because there's a couple of things we need to attend to over here before we're ready to drop our engine out. We need to disconnect the steering coupling at the steering rack, and we also need to deal with the battery cables, which at the moment are hidden behind this plastic wheel arch liner you can see here, which we're going to need to remove, and then we'll see how the battery POS cables are actually connected up on a bulkhead connector just behind that wheel arch liner. Okay, so we've moved that inner wheel arch liner. A craft knife works really good on it actually. Once you just get in there and just run down it, it comes out quite easily. And you can see the cable arrangements here that's under the under that wheel arch liner. You can see obviously an earth bolt that's connected on there, but this red cap here that you can see here is a junction for the main battery generator cable, which is actually bolted through an insulating block through the body. So instead of running that cable all the way down the outside of the car, they've made a junction there, and there's a pickup point on the inside of the vehicle for that cable. So obviously what we need to do is disconnect that. We need to disconnect that earth point. We need to disconnect some of the cable clamps. Cable clamps are here, and there's one just under here that we need to do. And then we'll be able to remove these two cables, which just swing down under here, because they're going to come out as part of the engine. Okay, so we're almost done with the cables. Disconnected the clamps and the earth and the positive cable. There's the mounting stud there it goes onto the body with. There's an electrical connector here that we need to disconnect, and there's also another one that runs under here to the steering rack that we need to take off as well. Okay, so we've freed off all the connectors now. While I've been under each wheel arch, I've also cut through the brake lines and blocked those off with little M4 set screws, and I've disconnected the connectors for the wheel speed sensors, so everything's ready to drop out there. Okay, here's a shot from underneath the car. It shows a couple of things that we'll need to do. The main engine crossmember mounting bolts are here, and one just on the other side, and then the front crossmember mounting bolts are here, and there's one just a little bit further forward. That you can't quite see. And you can also see just down by the catalytic converters the the gearbox cross member that we're going to need to dismantle before we can lower everything out. So we've got all the pipework, cables, everything disconnected now. So what we'll start to do now is start to slacken off all these main mounting bolts. There are 8 of them. And just start to drop things down a little bit. Right, just a couple of quick words on removing the gear lever, because it's not very obvious how this thing comes off. Sometimes the leather gaiter that clips in around here will still be attached. Very often it won't be, it'll slip down, but if you just pull it down anyway, and all you need to do is just get your screwdriver, just put a reasonable amount of firm upward pressure on this point here, and the whole thing just plops straight off. Doesn't screw on, so don't try that one.
We need to disconnect the top wishbone ball joint, as we can't access the wishbone to chassis bolts with the spring unit in place. Having split the joint apart, we can also undo the suspension strut retaining nuts on top of the inner wings.
I'll just show one of these joints that have been dismantled. You shouldn't have any problems getting a nut off. The problem is that they haven't really left enough hex on the end here for you to keep your 8mm spanner on it while you're undoing the main nut. So you might find you get it almost all the way off and then everything just starts turning. What you can do is, the joint doesn't need any persuasion to come apart, it'll be popping apart itself. Just put a pair of mole grips on that solid shank of the joint there, and that will prevent the joint stud itself from turning. You should be able to get the last threads of the nut off, and then that will just naturally pop out of that joint. It's not a taper joint or anything like that. Whatever you do, don't spoil the joint itself, because they're not available separately. Okay, so we've got our engine struck up, ready to go. There's a couple more things we need to disconnect before we can drop everything out. One thing is this connection here to that goes down to the heater water valve down here, which is part of the chassis. So we're going to need to disconnect that. Another one is this kind of like bypass pipe on here, which we need to remove. And the next one is much more problematic. Just go over here to the master cylinder, or the brake booster rather. I'll just move this pipe out of the way. You may well be able to see directly where the light is shining. There is, just where the tip of my finger shows there's a connector. It's actually the hard line to the clutch, and if you look carefully at this, you'll be able to see that there is a small spring clip that holds this thing on. So you pull the spring clip up, it's like a U-shaped clip, then that connector will just slide off. Obviously you'll get an escape of some fluid as well. Right, so we've got the KR strapped around the engine and subframe, and we've got axle stands underneath the chassis. What we're going to do now, we're going to put a part of an engine stand in place underneath to be able to support the engine and gearbox subframe assembly when that gets dropped out. We can't fit the road wheels because the suspension is just not going to support the weight of the unit. Try not to forget this one. There's a small rubber mounting at the right at the back of the gear change, just behind the gear lever, which is screwed onto the chassis. So that one needs to be removed. Otherwise your gearbox will be hanging on the back of that mounting and stuff's going to get bent. Okay, 2 8mm bolts. Okay, so view from underneath the car now. We've removed all the subframe mounting bolts, and we've got our little flat dolly in place, which is going to take the weight of the subframe and the engine gearbox. And once we've lowered everything into position, we're ready to just lower down now. I've just got a trolley jack at the back there just supporting the gearbox. Just going to undo the subframe, 4 13mm subframe mounting bolts for the gearbox, and then we're going to start lowering the whole thing down. Right, so we've lowered the, removed all the subframe bolts, removed the steering coupling, and we've now lowered the engine subframe suspension onto that flat dolly, and we've let the gearbox go at the rear. And the way this dolly's constructed, say the gearbox and the exhaust are just resting on it at the back. So the next job is to lift the car up with your crane and then slide all the engine and gearbox out from underneath. Right, so we've lowered the engine, gearbox and subframe assembly down below the car, and we're now raising the car up on the crane to be able to hoist the car over the engine. Once we get that out of the way, we can pull the engine forward and then lower the car back down. Okay, so there's the whole engine, suspension, gearbox unit on the flat dolly. We've raised the car up enough to be able to pull it from underneath, so just easily manoeuvre that out of the way. We're now going to put the front end of the car back down onto well, I'm going to use one of my axle dollies so that we can shove it around the workshop. We've got a few more things we've got to take off: pedal box, finish doing the windscreen wiper linkage, and a couple of other bits and pieces. But the idea of having this on a flat sort of bed with casters on is a great idea, because we can move that around now. We need to stow this and clean it all off later.